Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. And today we're going to be doing another analysis, and we're going to be doing an analysis of a UN speech given during the UN Assembly that happened in September. And it was given by the Kenyan president, President Ruto. And this speech in particular has been making a lot of buzz in the international law sector and in diplomatic sectors, and people are really talking about it. And in this speech, I'm only going to react to a segment of the speech where he's talking about the Africans nations being excluded from the UN Security Council. So let me give you a little bit of explanation on what is the UN Security Council. So we have the United Nations and its organs. So for example, UNICEF and you know the UNDP, that's the United Nations Development Program. So we have different UN organs, and then we have the UN system itself, and that's the system that does like the UN General Assembly. So everybody's a part of the UN system if you want to be, if a country wants to elect to be an active part of the UN system. So you can come and participate in the United Nations General Assembly. You can voice your opinion on certain United Nations things that are going on, topics. And then there is a sector, the United Nations Security Council. And the United Nations Security Council, I want you to think about it as the actual, that's where the power lies. So think about it like a nucleus, and that's the powerhouse. And that's what the UN Security Council is. But that UN Security Council, not every country is a part of it. There are I think, five core members, and those members have veto power. So that is the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, China. Yeah, so five. So they have veto power. So let's assume that there is a case of global importance and it comes to the UN Security Council. Russia can veto, China can veto. And that's honestly the reason why a lot of things don't get done, because of veto power. So it doesn't really matter if, let's say, Russia or China or United Kingdom or France wants to do something. If the US can veto, Russia can veto. And so it's like, it's very difficult for anything to get done with the UN Security Council, unless they, because it's like allies. So the United States is allied with the United Kingdom. Russia is always probably be allied to China. So it's like, if it has anything to do with their allies and matters that are important to their allies, nothing will get done. But of course, if it has something to do with African nations, where a lot of African nations are not allied with any Western nation, so a lot of times it'll get done fast to punish them or bring any resolution against them or something is going to get done fast. Also, the UN Security Council is the arm that refers cases to the International Court of Justice. So the International Court of Justice deals with cases between two nation states, right? So the UN Security Council will refer cases to the International Court of Justice. The International Criminal Court, on the other hand, it's an independent body, and it deals with cases for individual people. So individuals can be brought onto the International Criminal Court. And then the International Court of Justice is another arm of the United Nations. And the UN Security Council is the one that refers cases there. Whew, so that's an international law crash course for you. I am an international lawyer, so I went to school for this. I work in that right now. So I just gave you a summary of, so you can have a broad picture of why it's very important that President Ruto is speaking on the UN Security Council. A lot of African nations have felt disenfranchised by the United Nations, and honestly, as well as the International Criminal Court. So that's why his speech is going viral, as it is calling for very important reforms to the United Nations mandates and overall framework. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to the speech together. I have read transcript, but I haven't listened to it. And cadence and delivery is important when examining his speech. So we're going to do that together, and then we're going to talk about it as we go along. All right.
to stop aggression and war and bring nations together. Its ambitions were to achieve collective global security, disarmament, peaceful dispute resolution, and cooperation on humanitarian and social issues. Despite these ideals, the League of Nations failed. The United States never joined, other great powers came and went, and without enforcement authority, its condemnation carried little weight. When Japan invaded Manchuria, when Italy marched into Ethiopia, and when Hitler openly defied its rules, the League stood by, helpless and powerless. By the late 1930s, its credibility had collapsed, and with the outbreak of the World War II, it was rendered irrelevant. Madam President, this history is both a lesson and a warning. Institutions rarely fail because they lack vision or ideals. More often, they drift into irrelevance when they do not adapt, when they hesitate to act, and when they lose legitimacy. To remain relevant, institutions must be reimagined, must be reformed, renewed, and aligned with emerging realities. 8 decades ago, the founders of the UN sought to correct the failures of the League of Nations by creating a stronger, more inclusive organization anchored in the principles of, and I quote, "We the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war," end of quote. Today, we are gathered for the UN at 80. The question is unavoidable. Is the United Nations relevant to the demands of our time? Can it continue to serve humanity in the face of current realities? Or has it become a relic of a bygone era? Madam President, Excellencies, we meet against a grim global backdrop. Conflict rages in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and beyond. Climate disasters grow fiercer by the day. Inequality deepens, pandemics loom, and technological disruptions outpaces governance. Instead of trust, mistrust is spreading. Instead of solidarity, fragmentation is taking root. In place of hope, anxiety fills our global community. We are living, to borrow from the words of the founders of this institution, not in larger freedom, but in growing uncertainty. At this moment of turbulence, when we most need a strong United Nations, the organization faces its deepest crisis in credibility and capacity. Funding cuts have paralyzed its operations. Bureaucracy has slowed its response. The Security Council remains frozen in the post-war structures of 1945, unable to act inclusively, with fairness, and with speed. Ladies and gentlemen, I can, however, state with absolute conviction that the United Nations has been one of humanity's greatest achievements. For 8 decades.
Okay, so I want to stop there because there's something he said that I really loved. He said that there's so much going on in the world. So much. It's actually shockingly sad. And I mean, the only continent where I haven't heard anything from, maybe it's Australia. They seem to be coasting over there. But the rest of us, there's something in every continent. And we talk about the League of Nations, and if you know about the League of Nations, it's kind of like a pre-UN thing, and that failed because the United Nations was created for peace building, and it's peace at all costs. Like that should be the number one priority, and making sure that humanitarian, things are put at the forefront. Whenever I tell people that I'm an international human rights lawyer, they're almost like, oh, that is what, why are you doing that? That doesn't make sense. They say like, oh, that there's no use for that. But there is a use for that. Because even the United States, the one that, talks about, I feel like they're always bashing international law in the United States. The US was a huge part of creating the United Nations. And the US is a active part of the UN Security Council. They would not send diplomats to the United Nations. Donald Trump would not waste his time to come to the United Nations to give a speech if it were not important. The United Nations is important. It is imperative that the United Nations and international law systems must work. There is a reason why the International Criminal Court was set up. There is a reason why the International Court of Justice was set up. We must not disdain international law. There is a place for international law. And I know some people say I'm biased because I'm an international lawyer. No, but I'm actually speaking facts. International law is important. But when there is, with any institution, when there is disenfranchisement or disdain for the rules, people begin to say, okay, well, we're not sure we want to be a part of this anymore. Why are we not? Because it feels like nothing is getting done. It's a battle of powers. We don't want to be a part of that. And I don't blame them. And that is the reason why there must be reform to the United Nations Security Council. The last thing we want is for people to say that this is not needed, for us to believe the lie that international law systems are not needed, because they 1000% absolutely are. So let's continue with the.
It has held back the specter of global war, calmed conflicts from Cambodia to Liberia, and stood guard in some of the world's most dangerous places through the courage of its peacemakers and peacekeepers. Few institutions in humanity's history can claim such a legacy. The United Nations has stood at the front lines of humanitarian crisis, from famine relief in the Horn of Africa to emergency shelter for millions of Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. It was at the forefront in the eradication of smallpox, coordinated global responses to HIV and AIDS, Ebola, and COVID-19, and continues to champion universal vaccination. Its agencies have advanced women's rights, protected children, safeguarded refugees, and set global norms on everything from disarmament to climate action. The UN Sustainable Development Goals remain a shared blueprint for human progress. These are achievements no nation could have achieved alone, however rich, however great, or however powerful. And yet, every institution, no matter how noble its origins or impactful its legacy, must adapt to changing times or slide into irrelevance. Today, the United Nations stands at a crossroads of renewal on one hand or decay on another. Put differently, after 80 years, the rhymes of time are calling on us to reimagine the original promise that inspired the founding of the United Nations, and that is the quest for global peace, development, and human rights. But this call must now be answered in a global context that is profoundly different from the post-war era in which the UN was conceived then. We would be denying the cold, hard truth if we say that the United Nations is delivering as it should. On peace and security, its voice is too often drowned by the rivalries of great powers, while some nations simply ignore its resolutions and do as they please. Too often, the UN's blue helmet, once a
I also just want to mention, like in law school, when you're studying international law, one of the things they teach you is that international law, there needs to be a lot of political will, because it's different from national law. So some nations, when it's another country's turn, they want the country to do exactly as the UN resolution said. And then when it gets to their turn, they're like, we're not doing it because we don't have to. We cannot have that attitude when it comes to international law. There's a lot of things that in the UN Security Council system and how the UN makes decisions that are not very transparent, right? There are a lot of things that need to change. So I'm glad he's actually speaking up, because I was always wondering, why has this not been spoken about? And I also think it's because a lot of people, like citizens, don't really know what's going on in international law. And that's why I hope that with my podcast, you can come and really learn about government and things that are going on, not on the national fronts, because I feel like a lot of podcasters and there's amazing resources out there for you to learn. But on the international front, when it comes to foreign policy, do you know your government, your president, that's actually one of the powers of the executive, to make foreign policy on your behalf, to represent you at the international systems. And do you know they have more or less like carte blanche to do that. But a lot of people don't really understand international law, so they're not paying attention to what their presidents are doing at the international front. But when you're making decisions about who to elect, foreign policy and participation in international law, knowing what you want from your government on the international stage, should also be a part of your decision making when you're electing your president. And I'm not just speaking to the Americans, I'm not just speaking to the British people, I'm speaking to every single country. If you can choose your president's child, because some places you can't. But if you can, that should also be something, because your president can embarrass you on the international stage. He can, or they can, or she can embarrass you on the international stage. So you need to make sure that your desires are represented, grassroots, national, and international. It's incredibly important. Okay, let's go to the last stage so this video doesn't get too long.
Symbol of moral authority no longer commands the same respect. From the conflicts in Gaza to Ukraine, to the crisis in Sudan, DRC Congo, Somalia, and the Sahel, we see actors proceed undeterred by the United Nations calls. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Kenya speaks from the experience of a nation deeply invested in multilateralism. For decades, we have placed our troops and police in harm's way for peacekeeping missions across Africa and beyond, from Somalia to Democratic Republic of Congo, from South Sudan to most recently in our neighborhood here in Haiti. Over the past 15 months, we are proud to have led the multinational security support mission in Haiti, not because it has been easy, but because solidarity is the essence of the United Nations. Madam President, the mandate of the MSS mission is coming to an end in a few days. As the lead nation, allow me to briefly share our experiences, the success.
Yeah, so as you can see, Africans are participating heavily in manpower in contributing to the United Nations system.
Representation in the highest organ of global governance. This demand, however, continues to be ignored, deferred, or endlessly debated to the detriment of both Africa and the legitimacy of the United Nations itself. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible. Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance while decisions about peace, security, and development are made without our understanding, without our perspectives, and without our voice. Africa's exclusion is not only unacceptable, unfair, and grossly unjust, it also undermines the very credibility of the United Nations, this organization. Africa dominates most of the Security Council agenda, provides some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeeping forces, and bears the heaviest costs of instability. Yet we remain the only continent without a permanent seat at the main table, where decisions about our destiny are made. Africa deserves, ladies and gentlemen, at the very least, 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the right to veto, and 2 additional non-permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. The world must understand that reforming the Security Council is not a favor to Africa or to anybody. It is a necessity for the United Nations' own survival.
Yep. So that's what he said. And I mean, the President Ruto is not the perfect president or the perfect head of state. He is, he has been heavily criticized in his own country. But what he's saying here actually makes sense. It's not a favor. It's for the survival, so things can get done. 2 permanent seats at the UN Security Council is not a lot to ask, actually. So, and veto powers as well, and also it's restructuring on how votes are done. I think that is imperative for us to actually get stuff done in the international system, and I add my voice as well to that, advocating for that to come true. And I hope that the United Nations can see that it is needed. I hope they can wake up and see it's needed. And hopefully it's not after World War III that will then have a radical change that is very needed. I hope not. I hope they can anticipate and have the foresight to know what is needed so we can address the critical things that are happening right now around the world. So I also want to end by saying that, so we've spoken about the UN Security Council and I've explained to you the International Criminal Court. Well, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger announced ICC withdrawal. So they withdrew from the International Criminal Court. And they also cited unfairness in how the International Criminal Court assesses cases to trial. Again, that is also a thing. It's easier for the ICC to work for justice in African nations because there is no obstacle than for it to work for justice in other contexts where they have allies in the US, UK, etc. So I would not really fault that for the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, but I just want you guys to understand how politics also plays a role in international system, and it shouldn't. So the International Criminal Court as well also needs to strong reforms. And I want to continue to think that the new generation of diplomats, international lawyers will, hopefully advocate for the right things. Okay, so if you have reached the end of this video, I want to say thank you very much. This is a very long video, but it's important to get into the nooks and crannies of this situation and keep you guys informed of what's going on the international stage. So if you're not yet subscribed, it's free. You don't really lose anything. Just subscribe, please. And also share. I want to hear your thoughts on this on the comment section. And especially if you're from Kenya, how do you think your president did? I'll see you guys on the next video. Bye.